Hello and welcome. If Britain's current economic climate is making you think seriously about moving abroad, you'll be interested in hearing the wisdom of today's guest castaway, Niall Allardice. Now, Niall is a professional financial advisor who specialises in helping pioneers from the UK get their banking, investments and tax obligations in order as they transition to a new life overseas. And judging by the number of aircraft that have flown over the island today, he has his work cut out for him. So, without further delay, let's get started with this, episode 46 of the Desert Island Investor. This episode of the podcast is generously hosted by Progressive Equity Research. Visit their website at progressive-research.com.
With the calmer seas, we have our first guest podcastaway of 2026 sail out to join us, and perhaps it's easier for him than most as he did serve in the Royal Navy, so thanks for your service. There has been a lot of coverage over the last couple of years about people relocating overseas, and this can be for professional, lifestyle or financial reasons, and many private investors are looking for a better quality of life abroad. All my castaways have been people I know, and I'm delighted that joining us today is another of my good friends, Niall Allardice, and he works for Blevins Franks, who are leading tax and wealth management advisors to UK nationals living in Europe. Now, Niall is a Scot, and I have a theory that the further Scots live away from Scotland, the more Scottish they become, and Niall lives on the south coast of England. Niall has kindly brought along a haggis for us to enjoy. I thought we were currently in the close season for haggis shooting, but anyway, Paul has removed the gunshot, plucked and gutted it, and he's currently cooking it over the campfire. Welcome to the island, Niall.
Hi, Mark. Thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here.
Right, so just for our audience, I know you've had to explain this a number of times in the past. You must be bored of it, but you are a Niall and not a Niall.
Yes, correct. It's the Gaelic spelling, so the Irish tend to be Niles, the Scots tend to be Nials. I'm slightly concerned, though, that there's a new drama series starting in the next couple of days where the person that's written it is also a Scotsman from Fife, and the lead character is spelt the same way, Niall. So if they're on that and they actually pronounce it Niall, I'm going to be in deep doo-doo with my wife, because she says, why don't you just call yourself Niall, because that tends to be the default most people go to, but my mum and dad were insistent I'm a Niall.
Okay, well, we're always in trouble with our wives one way or another anyway. So let's jump straight in. Blevins Franks, what do they do and what is your specific role, please?
You said in your intro, really, we're a wealth management firm, but that can actually mean many things. And Blevins Franks is, I'm going to say, very different from the average wealth manager. And the reason for that is our history as a firm goes back over 50 years now, and we were formed to help people who were leaving the UK and effectively going to mainly Europe. In that time, though, as we've built ourselves up as a company, we also then really have three strings to our bow. It's people who are leaving the UK and going to Europe, people who are already in Europe and returning back to the UK, and then we also have quite a large UK business as well. And another thing that really sets us apart from the average wealth manager is size-wise, we have in-house chartered tax advisors, we have in-house lawyers, so we can really do the full picture of advice. We don't have to send people off to tax advisors where their situation is quite complex. There is one other thing as well, though, that our business in Europe is so well established, and so many of the people that actually work for us in those offices abroad, they'll help people relocating with things like visas. They'll help them find an accountant in the country they're going to, a lawyer if they need it. We work with estate agents abroad to help people find houses. And perhaps one of the biggest things is because we are members of the expat communities out there, we effectively will take people around if they want us to and introduce them to, various groups. So they hit the ground and immediately have somewhere to go and other people who they can talk to and help them there. So it's really much broader than just being a wealth manager. It really is helping them with a lifestyle choice. And I guess one final thing to say there is, since the dreaded B word Brexit, there used to be a lot of UK financial advisors or wealth managers who had, and since Brexit, they've not been able to officially deal with those people, give them advice and give them service. That's come to a head recently with the FCA starting to fine firms who still have EU situ clients. So we actually are doing more and more with other UK wealth managers and financial advisors where we are taking over their clients abroad and helping them. That's the firm. I mean, I specifically, I am a financial advisor by title, but my real role is really going out and speaking to people, finding out, about their situation, finding out what they need, and then knowing where to use the resources within the firm to give them the advice they need. And, a lot of that advice it's not product driven, it's strategy. What do you need to do when you get to that country to become tax resident? What are the pitfalls? So as I say, I'm really that middleman between our clients and our back office experts, and making sure we all understand each other and the people get the help they need.
Okay, so you've gone from able seaman to able financial advisor then, Neil?
Correct.
So there's been lots of media coverage about, let's call it the brain drain or an exodus of the wealthy from the UK. From where you're sitting, is that fact or fiction?
This is quite a long answer, Mark, but I think it's an important answer for people to understand. When you say there's been a lot in the press, I think most, if you Googled this, you'd find Henley Partners, who are a firm who help people relocate worldwide, published some articles. They were attacked by a lot of the more centre and left-leaning tax groups like Taxpayers Alliance, Tax Justice Network about the data and how they got to it. And did you ever watch a comedy series called Yes Minister or Yes Prime Minister?
Yeah, I think I've watched it numerous times. It's the only thing they seem to put on television these days.
Yeah, well, there's a great example in there of how you ask a question, a survey, and get the answers you want. And when you look at this, the detail that's in there, you think, well, the people are just swaying the facts to support their own argument, but they're not really facts, because for one example is, the Tax Justice Network and other people said, well, if you actually look at the data, the amount of people leaving is less than 1% of the UK millionaires. But if you then correlate that 1% to, well, do the top 1% of people in the income earners in the UK pay 28% of income tax. So even if it is only a small fraction of those people leaving, a lot, every pound of tax revenue you lose, you have to replace somehow, or you have to cut services. And the forecast income tax for 25-26 tax years, £329 billion. 28% of that, i.e. the amount paid by the top 1%, is 92 billion. So if they all did leave, to recoup that, 1 pence on income tax gets you about £7 to £8 billion. That's an important thing. But again, the data in the news reports is historical. You have to remember that non-dom status was only officially scrapped from April last year. So we don't really have any real data yet to see if people are leaving the country in the number suggested, or what impact that's going to have on UK PLC. We'll see that data in the coming months as it starts to be published, and then we'll really have a better view. I said this is a long answer, and I think I can now actually talk, from my perspective, the people I'm talking to and what we're seeing as a firm. The number of inquiries we've had for people going abroad has spiked significantly. But within the people who ask about going abroad, only a small percentage ever actually do that. But that's remained reasonably confident. So if more people are asking and inquiring, the likelihood is over time, more people will actually end up leaving. The thing, though, is a lot of people, when they start thinking about this, they don't say, right, I'm leaving tomorrow. They say, well, I'm going to tie this in with my retirement in 2, 3, 4, 5 years, or I'm already retired, but I've got youngish kids at school. So I think it will take time really to see how this impacts people. The final thing I actually want to say on that is, again, and this is looking at from sort of the left side of the political argument, when they say about these people not wanting to pay tax. I've actually found the opposite when I deal with people. I have been fortunate enough to work for a couple of billionaires, but I've never advised them. But I have met a lot of people who are, by definition, extremely wealthy. And the greatest example I know of personally is the owner of Aston Villa Football Club, there's a couple of them, but one of them is Egypt's richest man. Now, it's in the press. He's left the UK and he's gone to Italy, and he cited the changes to the tax system. But when you dig down beneath the surface, a barber that a client of mine used said, yeah, he and about 17 of his staff in London used to come in and have their haircut here. Now none of them are here. They've all left because they all work in that sort of what they call a family office. So they've all gone to Italy. So there is definitely a loss of revenue. Whether or not that turns out to be serious or not, only time will tell. But I certainly think the problem is, as I say, the left isn't looking at it from every pound that goes needs to be replaced. And maybe the right are guilty of exaggeration of numbers and consequences. But as always, the truth's going to be somewhere in the middle. So apologies, a very long answer, but hopefully I'm basing my my answer in fact and not hyperbole.
Yeah, well, a few people just crop up in mind. Jim Ratcliffe, he's left Tyson Fury, Rio Ferdinand. Every time one of those leaves, I think, well, the rest of us are going to have to shoulder a bit more of the tax take. But on those, it segues in quite nicely, because I think Jim Ratcliffe's gone to Monaco, Tyson Fury's gone to the Isle of Man, and Rio Ferdinand's gone to Dubai. So where are the popular locations that Brits are emigrating to, and how does this differentiate between those that are going for work, those that are retiring, and those that are for purely financial reasons?
Well, I can't really answer that question from a work perspective, because the majority of the inquiries we get are people who are either retiring or going to be retiring, as I said, in 2, 3, 4 years, or those already retired. So I don't know about people going to work. But as a company, we have offices and expertise and are regulated in Portugal, France, Spain, Malta, Cyprus, and Monaco. So I can talk quite well about those countries, and I believe both our own figures and the figures for the UK in general are still about 70% of people end up in either Portugal, France, or Spain. And the reason for that is, again, usually nothing to do with tax. It's to do with lifestyle and the fact that people who are going have holidayed there, enjoyed the places, and like it. And I'm sure you've no doubt read, and we've seen this, is when people do come to us with a question of, I'm thinking of retiring here or somewhere else, Dubai is often, a place that comes up. But we've already, because of what's been happening over the last 2 months, basically nobody that said they were thinking about Dubai is still saying they're going to go to Dubai. So a lot of it is driven by, in our opinion, if you have connections to the UK, in other words, you have family, children, grandchildren, you tend to stay in locations that are fairly close to the UK. So, I think you're still going to see France, Portugal, and Spain as perhaps the main place that a lot of people end up going.
Okay, so we can just open up on that a bit. Besides the tax for expats, what are the other considerations? Language, proximity to the UK, climate, affordability, healthcare, education, quality of life, perhaps costs in old age. What are the other things that people are looking at?
Well, it is all of those, but it is mainly lifestyle. So as I say, even though you can get tax benefits by going to all of the countries we work in, and sometimes significant tax benefits, it's actually quite rare for people to come to us and say, I just want to minimize my tax. We do get the occasional one like that, but people, as I say, there's often a previous connection, which is usually a holiday, or they've already had a holiday home there or something like that. But of the things you mentioned, again, this is all determined by the people's situation, where they have family in the UK, which they most often do. In our situations, proximity is a big one, because they like the idea of, being able to jump on a plane and come back and see family, and vice versa. They want it to be easy for their family to come out and see them. But the other one is, Malta, as an example, has got one of the best tax regimes, is English speaking, and on the surface appears to be a great place to go, both for the lifestyle. But it's a bit like Dubai, in that we know a lot of people who've been in Dubai and end up returning, and they say the reason is they get bored. It's just too small, and there's not a lot of things to do in places like that after you've been there for 6-9 months. Whereas if you're in Spain, Portugal, France, and you've got a car, which most people end up doing, they can jump in the car and cross the border into Portugal, or travel to different parts of Spain, in the mountains one week, down by the coast the next. So as I say, I think it really is that lifestyle element that people are looking for, and of course climate tends to be a big part of that. As we all know here, Mark, as you age, the bones start hurting a bit more, and it's warmer climates tend to be a bit better on things like that. So as I say, it's rarely just about tax, it's more about a combination of things.
Okay, well, I'm not quite as old as what I look there, Neil, but just on, people go for a holiday, and they might be there on a regular basis. How often do people do sufficient due diligence? There's a difference between going to some of these resorts during the summer, and then in the winter they might have a bit of a surprise that everything's shut up and there's nobody knocking around.
Well, like anything in life, the problem to answer that question is none of us know what we don't know. So what I would say is, the very fact that people come to us would point to them doing some due diligence, but they often for an answer to one or two specific questions. And it's only when we get into a deeper conversation with them and we point out things that they often haven't considered, that they appreciate there's a lot more to it than, effectively just trying to get a residence visa, then moving over there. It's like, do you need a health card? What about health insurance in the countries you're going to? So we definitely don't try and complicate matters by adding to things. But of course, we want to make sure people are well informed when they go. So, we raise points that we deem to be important. So it's not that they don't necessarily don't do their due diligence. It's they don't appreciate oftentimes at the beginning how much goes into actually picking up sticks and moving to a different country altogether.
Mm. Well, I've just returned from Panama, which gets a lot of coverage for its tax. And with these countries that can offer competitive rates, when we see like what the UK is taxing us, what do we enjoy? What are we getting that these other countries aren't through the tax take? How come other people can be more competitive than the UK?
I mean, there's probably two parts to that answer. The main one being how the taxes received in those countries are actually spent, or where they generate their national income from. So the UK tends to have a higher welfare budget than most countries in the EU. We have a totally free healthcare system, whereas other countries in Europe, there tends to be a combination of, insurance and paying for treatment on the spot. And if you ask anyone who's had treatment in Spain or France or Cyprus about the healthcare system, I think all you'll hear is talk about fantastic experiences, how quick things actually occur. So whilst I'm a lover of the NHS and my wife works for the NHS, I'm always a bit surprised by this dogma over here that we have to always have free healthcare. Surely we want the best healthcare system, but that would be part of the answer. You know, Portugal, for example, doesn't have a large military. We do, so some of our money goes there. And again, another part of that would be that whilst these countries offer some tax incentives, they also will tax people on global income and global investments. And if you read about golden visas, they're often time restricted, so we'll give you some favourable tax treatment initially to attract you here in the hope that you come here, you love the lifestyle and you settle here, and eventually you end up paying a bit more in tax. You know, obviously, if you think about Dubai or any countries like that where they pay no tax, that's because at the moment the national income comes from natural resources, i.e. oil in that case, and those countries are prepared to pay for everything. But if you look at what's going on in Saudi and other countries, they're all about trying to broaden their income base, because if we do go on a push towards net zero, then eventually less and less of their income will come from things like that, and the taxation system will have to change. So I don't know if that's answered the question, but as I say, I think I certainly know from the stuff I read, people think a lot of the tax in the UK is wasted on things. So I think it mainly comes down to how that taxation income is spent.
Yeah, well, I certainly think there is a lot of waste. And you talk about the NHS, and when you mentioned that it's free, it's not free. It's free at the point of delivery, isn't it? We're still pumping lots of money into it. Yeah, but on that point, we touched on it earlier about, you know, it's one thing, you know, leaving the UK, but, you know, people do come back. And how often do you find that it's people find out very quickly, or after a period of time, that the circumstances have changed, it's not for them, or that, you know, they're coming back to spend their twilight days in Old Blighty?
I'm going to say it's quite, certainly the people I've come across, it's quite rare for them to end up not coming back, because going back to your early question about due diligence, people have, we get people, for example, who say, I love area X, I'm going to rent there for 12 months and make sure, I like it and it's the right area for me. So they don't go all in the sense of cut all ties with the UK or most ties with the UK, and, they go for full tax treatment. So for that reason, I think, a lot of people do go abroad and they stay abroad for extended periods. It does tend to be, though, that the reasons people come back are changing circumstance. One being, two really is their health, or the death of a partner that they've gone abroad with, and then, they often come back. My own mother and my father died in the 90s. My mother got a new partner. They both moved to Cyprus in 2008. He passed away unexpectedly. It was very sad, but my mum chose to stay there. So, as I say, people don't always come back on the death of a partner. I know lots of my mum's friends now in Cyprus, and I talk to them, and unfortunately there's lots of occasions when people have passed away, but say a lot of them stay. So, but that does, in our experience, tend to be the two main things. It's death of a partner or health will bring them back. Or I guess the third one is just sometimes their own family, the grandchildren grow up, or there's great grandchildren arrive and they just want more interaction with them. But very rare do they go and realise they've made a mistake and come back. So, or certainly the clients we have, that's a very rare thing.
Yeah. Could you please elaborate on some of the, on the returning, that, perhaps people have not factored in the possibility that they would have to return, and some of the common mistakes that people make?
Yeah, I guess there's not really many, because the fact that people are UK citizens going abroad means they don't have any visa issues or anything like that when they come back. So, but there are a few things. the main sort of 2/3 would be timing when they actually come back. Because if you've gone abroad and lived abroad for a reasonable number of years, the chances are you've restructured your investments to be more applicable to the tax regime you're living in, i.e. in that country. And therefore, when you come back, you might, if you were talking to us, for example, we might say, well, now you're going back to the UK, your expenses are GBP, sterling, British pounds, do you want to change your currency? And that can mean retweaking investments and potentially triggering tax charges. So the timing issue basically means that you can often create a window of opportunity when you can leave country A tax efficiently and come back to the UK tax efficiently if you get the timing right. The other part, we had an interesting one last year, and I know you've got a question about this later on, but when the rules changed last April around the non-DOMs and what's now called long-term residents, we had a few people who were ready to come back who'd been abroad for 9 years, 6 months, 9 years, 9 months. And, so we were able to say to them, are you able to, extend it to 10 years? Because if you do, you're going to put yourself in positions. So generally speaking, people did. They either stayed with friends or just went on a cruise for 3 months and didn't come back to the UK. The other big one, though, would be mainly, say, around property and capital gains tax, because it tends to be most people, if they're going to go abroad for an extended period of time, they do end up buying in the country they're going to. And each country has different treatment of main homes for capital gains tax purposes. So if you're in too much of a rush to come back, you might find that you're not able to sell the property that you're in. That creates a double tax issue because you might have capital gains tax in the country the property's in. And then you potentially, because you're coming back to the UK and it's not your main residence, you might have a capital gains tax issue in the UK as well. So that would be something that certainly when we're working with people, we say, please give us as much notice as you can of potential changes. Not always possible, but generally we would say that, and we can talk them through the issues beforehand and make sure they're aware of what returning to the UK within a set time frame will mean. And, where people have the flexibility, they will generally heed that advice and try and plan around it.
Right. Well, this one, given my profile, I get a number of people reaching out to me, and some have been from your competitors, I suppose, and they wanted to speak to me, so I've given them some time, and we talked about certain scenarios, and they've come out with phrases like you'll probably be all right, should be, and all being well, and if I'm in trying to manage my wealth, I want something to be bang on. And it's encouraging that Blevins Franks have been around for 50 years. But I get the sense with some of these people, they're just chasing, trying to sell me a product, get a commission. And then if it goes bad, where are they going to be? And I hear people talking about that they've been badly advised. Is there any recourse if people do receive bad advice? And just on where people get the material, what's the source material for all the advice that we receive?
Well, as I say, I've been in the industry now. This is my 34th year, and if I went back just 10 years, offshore advice often was called the Wild West of the advisory sector, and that was usually because most advisors were unregulated. They weren't being paid a salary, so they live or die by, generating a commission. That's why it's worthwhile working with an advisor who is regulated, because you have recourse there. So again, if I use us as an example, which I obviously should do because I know about us, in all the countries in Europe we operate in, we are regulated. We're regulated in the UK, so the advice we give is it's not checked, but we will report to the regulator in each country or where we're regulated as we need to. And that means if clients are unhappy with what we've done, they, first and foremost, any regulation always says complain to the company that gave you the advice. If you're not happy with the answer, there's usually something like an ombudsman type scheme you can go to. And it's that's where your fallback basically comes from. With that in mind, though, again, you've got to bear in mind that things like tax regimes change. So if you just want to get a bit of advice now, and then in 3 or 4 years you find out something's changed, if you've not got we want to work with people on an ongoing basis because of the fact things are constantly being tweaked at the fringes. So we keep them aware of same people. What's interesting about investing, Mark, and I love saying more taxation. I think once the difficulty of retiring with investing is people often go into a retirement with the same mindset that they had when they were trying to build up their wealth and get ready for retirement. And it often takes 12 to 24 months to settle into retiring, income, expenditure, what's coming in, what's going out. The more you rely on an investment portfolio for generating the income you need, then clearly the more effect changes in things like market conditions, changes in inflation can have an impact on that. So what was actually good advice for somebody 3, 4, 5 years ago may no longer be good advice. But again, was that they got poor advice at the beginning, or was that people have just wanted one-off advice and think they can deal with that? I think it falls somewhere in between quite often, and I'm not debating or denying that there are poor advisors out there in unregulated firms. So that would be the first thing I would say to anyone in terms of source material or what you're always trying doing. If you are trying to find somebody to help you make these really important decisions, then first of all, try and understand, are they regulated or not? And if they're not, then you really need to seriously consider what you're going to do in terms of taking advice. You can go up the food chain, as in the big 4 accountancy firms operate in a number of countries. So there's a reputational issue there. They may not be regulated in a particular country, but if they give poor advice, then their reputation's on the line. So there's an element of fallback there. But that's the mistake people make and to blame for this, I think, because there's information at our fingertips. We can easily find it. AI is making that even better. And going back to one of the questions when I said we don't know what we don't know, if you don't know what questions to ask, you may end up going down a dark hole. So, as I say, I think number one, I would say to people, regardless of which country you're going to, try and find an advisor that's regulated. And then from there, you can ask them what would happen if something went wrong. And they will provide you with the material that you can look into. You can research, make sure you're being told the truth. Countries that are regulated, you can go to the regulator's website, you can check the firms listed there. There's a number of things that you can do that people tend not to. But as I say, hopefully more and more places are regulated now, so hopefully poor advice will become a thing of the past. But I know it's still out there and has been a historical problem.
Well, I think I'm quite a competent private investor, but this is much different to estate planning and wealth management, moving countries and understanding different tax structures. Do you find certain high net worth individuals fall into the trap of thinking that they know it all?
Not really. Actually, to be correct, I mean, the answer probably falls into 2 distinct areas. On the taxes and regulations side, no, people don't usually think they know it all. On the investing side, because self-investments become far more common, people along the lines of, I just want you to advise me on this. I'm quite happy doing the investments myself. I've got no beef to pick with that. I mean, I think it's important you try and learn about these subjects and understand what's going on. But the problem is how the 2 bits interact looking ahead. So, for example, in Portugal and Spain, there's certain ways that you can hold investments that give you really beneficial treatment. So let's say, for the sake of example, say it's maybe equivalent to the UK type ISA wrapper, where you get tax-free returns. Abroad, you can have similar vehicles that give you favourable tax treatment. But the problem with a lot of those vehicles is the companies that administer them, that issue them, that allow you to invest through them, because they're regulated entities, they don't deal direct with Joe Public. And the reason they choose not to do that is because of the amount of regulation that's coming in. A lot of Europe tends to follow the UK, and the companies, if it's not a wealth management firm or financial advisor that introduce the client to them, then the company themselves become liable to do things like know your client, anti-money laundering checks. They do a lot of work. So you create this problem, therefore, that if you want to get the best tax outcome, you often have to be prepared to, work with an advisor, and that's where the problem comes. It's not that people know it all; it's just they perhaps don't see the value in working with an advisor. And again, I understand that historically, so I would say that's down to people like myself and the firms we work for to make sure we clearly illustrate the value. So no, definitely not that they have a know-it-all, but they often don't perceive the value, I think, in why they perhaps should work with an advisor.
Yeah. All right. Well, despite leaving the UK, we are allowed a sliding scale of days to return each year, and these depend on the number of what they call ties under the statutory residence test. So can you, these provide a little bit of flexibility. Can you just outline how these work, Neil?
Well, one of the things I should have said in my intro is, although I'm a financial advisor, been doing this 34 years, and I know a lot about UK taxes, I don't call myself a tax expert. And although I have enjoyed learning about things like that over the years, since I've been at Blevins Franks and seen the abilities of our tax group, and they know more than I could ever know. So I've tended to, when we advise people, the statutory residence test is something that we go through in our reports and tell them, based on what you've told us, this is the situation that will apply to you. But with that in mind, I can say, there's three parts to the statutory residence test. Two tests come into play before you even look at ties. One is the automatic overseas test, and one is the automatic UK test. Most people leaving the UK will fail on those two, so it does come down to ties. And again, ties depend on whether you're a leaver or you're an arriver. They're looked at slightly differently. Most people in our case that we deal with are UK people looking to leave the UK. So the ties are basically, have you been tax resident in the UK in the 3 previous tax years? Are you going to work more than 40 days in the UK? Do you have UK resident family? Do you have a UK accessible UK accommodation? And as I say, more than 90 days in the previous 2 tax years. So you've got to look at these things very carefully to understand, are you tax resident or not? Because a lot of people, when they come to us, and this goes back again, linking in with one of your earlier questions, Mark, about due diligence, people often have done a bit of reading and they go, well, I understand if I'm 183 days in that country or so-and-so here, I'm like, and they think it's that simple, but unfortunately it's not. So it will usually, for most people, come down to how many ties that you actually have with the UK. And as you said, Mark, you're 100% spot on. That will determine how many days you can spend in the UK once you've left and become non-tax resident. Most people, I can tell you, on leaving have at least 2 ties. That's i.e. they've been UK tax resident in the previous 3 years, and they often keep a home in the UK. So for that reason, that means most people will be limited to 90 days once they've left the UK, at least initially. That changes over time. There are, again, just the ounce of planning. Just by if you're caught out by the family or you have a UK home ties, there's things you can do there which can remove that tie from being applicable and can up the number of days you spend in the UK. So if you're leaving with the intent to spend quite a bit of time in the UK, just understanding what those ties are and how you can legally influence them can greatly impact the time you can spend in the UK.
Well, you've just answered one of my subsequent questions as well. But on the, I think when we're moving to get out of the UK tax net, if we can put it in that kind of term, that you do need some kind of permanent residence overseas, but you don't necessarily need to buy a property. You can rent one, I believe.
Yeah, correct. And that will vary from country to country, because to be able to prove to HMRC you're no longer tax resident, the only thing they'll accept is a notice from the tax people in the country that you've ended up in saying this person is now a tax resident in Spain, Portugal, France, wherever. So that has to be an official document, and therefore, in order to become tax resident in different countries, you obviously have to go through the criteria that applies there. And again, I'll use France. Portugal is the same. A lot of people go, well, it's 183 days. I have to be there for 183 days, but it's not. I mean, you can be officially tax resident in France or Portugal from the moment you land on the plane, depending on certain other criteria. So, as I say, it's not necessary to buy a property, as I alluded to earlier. Most people, but we have people who will, and I said not many people go abroad purely for tax reasons, but we have some who do. So they will often say, well, I'm going to go to tax country A because I can get the most beneficial tax treatment there, and then once I've spent a year or two there, I'll then move to the country where I actually end up want to be, and therefore they might end up renting. So you're absolutely right, no need always. Sometimes the answer is yes, and a lot of golden visas are based on the idea of buying a property somewhere bought for a minimum value, but it's not always absolutely necessary.
Okay. So just on the amount of time that people come back, how often do you find it that people max out their allowance, or on the opposite end of the spectrum, they don't bother returning
that's
at
actually
all?
really often tied to family. So I personally know people who've gone abroad with no family, and whilst they want the right to return to the UK, their intentions are, I might pop back for a couple of weeks, see my friends or what have you. At the other end of the scale, we've got people who are saying, well, my children are still in their early 20s. I'm keeping my home, so my intention is to max out the allowance when I come back. As is usually the case, the truth is, if you take the average, is somewhere probably in the middle, and that people will rarely actually use the maximum entitlement. But it's a bit like everything in life. We always like to have a safety net behind us, don't we? So they might know they can come back for 90 days, 120 days, 40 days, whatever it is, and they won't do that, but they like the idea of being able to, just in case.
Yeah. So let's assume that somebody has 90 days that they can play with. Now, it would be very tempting to come back June, July and August, perhaps for the weather, and then you're burnt through all your days. Are there any extenuating circumstances should something happen that you need to come back in a tax year? If you're ill or you need an operation, if there's a COVID lockdown or a family funeral, is there a special dispensation for those, or is it just tough? You've used all your days up.
Well, you'd like to think if a government, as they did in COVID, said, right, that's it, nobody's allowed to move, that they wouldn't then penalise you for being there. And the answer to the question is yes. There is something called the exceptional circumstances rule that will basically potentially give you more freedom to come back to the UK. Now, again, I'm talking about the UK here, not other countries. They may see this differently. What might surprise people a little is exceptional circumstances, though, doesn't cover things like coming back for a funeral. or it generally doesn't. There's talk about some people challenging that in the courts, linked to various other factors, but HMRC wouldn't look at coming back for a funeral as circumstances. However, if you were in the UK and you fell seriously ill, then that would tend to be an exception. We've mentioned COVID. I mean, I'm sure most of us, most people listening to this will. Do you remember was it the Icelandic volcano clouds and things like that, which stopped flights or made it difficult? Was that 15, 20 years ago? So there are. What they call natural disasters are things that would perhaps see you allow the exceptional circumstances. But as I say, you need to be very careful if you just think a funeral for even a family member. I mean, it's not an automatic exception just to come back for a funeral.
Okay. I mean, I was flying out from Madrid to Panama, and we were all ready to go, and then we all had to get off the plane. In order, because they couldn't shut the door, of all things. They couldn't shut the door on the plane. But so if you were like at night, just a scenario, if you're up at your 90 days, it's coming up to midnight. You get off to the plane, and the plane was scheduled to leave at 10 o'clock, and then it went into another day. What would happen under that circumstance?
I would hope. I mean, you can never say until the actual situation occurs that that would be looked at as exceptional, because it's something beyond your control. Although I'm sure some people would say, well, depending on the time of the day that happened, you could have perhaps looked if there were any other flights available. But I think that would be a bit ridiculous to look at things that where line says we're really sorry, we've got you all on a flight tomorrow. To count that as a day would be, in my opinion, ridiculous. But who knows? But it's beyond your control. So I would hope that would be seen as exceptional. If there was a volcano cloud that stopped flights, they don't really expect you then. Okay, well, if the airlines say we can go in 2 days, and my understanding is they don't expect you to then go out and hire a car and drive to a ferry port and jump on a ferry. And so as I say, I hope a bit of common sense comes into play there, even in this day when common sense is a bit lacking.
Yeah, okay. So, our tax year runs, is it from the 5th to the 6th of April? And tax years are varied from country to country. Can this make things complicated when they run from?
Yeah, I mean, the good news is our tax year being the 6th of April to the 5th is the outlier, definitely outlier. Almost every other country has the calendar year as their tax year. So I'm not even sure it's complicated, because with complication becomes opportunity. And that's where I say the timing of when you leave the UK can be really important from a tax perspective. You can create a window of opportunity. And similarly, when you come back, because of those tax years not aligning, you're able to create situations when you can be non-tax resident in a particular country for a period of time. And with complication comes opportunity.
So is it worth not making any bold investment decisions where possible until the end of the tax year? Perhaps if you made a large capital gain and then unexpectedly had to return to the UK, it could be costly. And at the end of a tax year, there are fewer unknowns.
Yes and no. I mean, again, it depends on which country you're in and what flexibility that you have, because you wouldn't, for example, if you were returning to the UK from one of the countries we operate in, leaving a big decision till the end of the UK tax year wouldn't be advisable. You'd probably be, if you're being properly advised, you're probably looking to leave later in the calendar year, because you can create this situation when you're non-resident somewhere, and you don't have to worry about the tax consequences then if you get that planning right. So this ties back into why knowing ties and the number of days and various other things becomes decision making. So UK-wide, though, Mark, I agree with you. If you were staying in the UK and you are a UK person, as I said, we have a number of clients who that's applicable to. Often leaving things to later in the tax year is great, because you have a set of known knowns rather than unknowns then.
All right. Well, you've given some long answers, but this is a long question, but bear with me. So in the past, it's been a case with expats and tax that, let's put it, you can run, but you can't hide. You know, you may have been an overseas tax resident and out of the clutches of HMRC, but upon death, domicile rules kicked in, and it's too difficult to throw that off, and they get you in the end. Now, the most quoted case is Richard Burton, who was a tax exile in Switzerland for 27 years. However, upon death, HMRC argued that because he'd bought a burial plot in Wales, which was never used, he was buried in Switzerland, but he had a Welsh flag on his coffin and had Dylan Thomas poems read at his funeral. The argument was that he'd never truly severed his ties with the UK. And it was a very nebulous arrangement. Now, retaining your membership of the cricket club for nostalgic or philanthropic reasons could end up being very costly for your beneficiaries. And you never really knew if you'd avoided inheritance tax until you were dead. And let's face it, HMRC are not working diligently in order to find your estate does not pay inheritance tax. They want their cut wherever possible, and any tenuous link will suffice. However, in her first budget, Rachel Reeves brought in the residency-based system to replace domicile, based upon being in the UK 10 of the last 20 years. And this was brought in primarily to clamp down on non-doms. Now, the flip side is that this has some advantages for Brits abroad, and conveniently has some harder edges and gives some certainty to the future of the estate. Now, I'm friendly with one particular non-dom who was approaching his 10th year in the UK, and he's returned to his country of birth, so it was no hardship to him. And I'm sure others have done that, or indeed gone to a third country. So some people put down very shallow routes. They've moved before, and they've got the relocation skill. And with modern technology, they can operate remotely. And again, there's that reward now for British expats. You know, those with the broadest shoulders also have the longest and the fastest legs, and they're not, you know, they're mobile, not rooted slavishly. So my question is, has this move to target non-doms actually backfired?
Well, for once, we actually had a government who created a policy that made the situation much clearer than the non-doms or the domicile situation, because as you point out, that people leaving the UK previously could try and become non-domicile, but the slightest thing could have easily seen HMRC argue that they'd never managed to achieve that. And I'd also heard that in the Richard Burton case, I'm sure in his will, he said he wanted to be buried in a red and green suit to represent the colours of his homeland Wales, and that was another reason they said he had never left. But the new rules are hugely beneficial in that they're simple. Once you've been here for 10 years, you are subject to UK taxes on everything. Once you've been abroad for UK, 10 years, you're not subject to UK inheritance tax unless you have UK situ assets. So, but I would add one comment in on non-doms is there's a very big difference between the people who are the billionaires who this likes to talk about, because the main issue they're going is to say if they're global company that, and again, you probably know if you're worth 10 billion, it's not you have 10 billion investments, you probably have 9.5 billion tied up in a company that you run and founded. So the problem for non-doms is not that they were worried about paying a little bit of tax each year. It's the fact that that company now becomes subject to UK inheritance tax. And, you know, if it's a 10 billion company, your beneficiaries have got to find 4 billion, which they won't be able to do, which means the company has to be sold. And so there's, I think it has backfired to an extent, because what they think they're targeting and what they're actually going to achieve are different things. And as I say, more and more people now who are abroad will be happy to stay abroad for 10 years and then return, because the rules as they're written give them some favourable tax treatment.
All right, thanks. So, Neil, you know, just on the nil rate band, you know, this is at 325,000, and this hasn't increased since way back in 2009. And you know, one's for the very wealthy. This is drawing in more and more people down the wealth ladder. Are you specifically seeing inheritance tax as more and more of a consideration?
Again, the simple answer is yes, but perhaps not to the extent you think, because throughout my entire time in the financial services industry, and there's polling to show this, inheritance tax is broadly seen across the political spectrum as one of the most unfair taxes there are. Most people haven't inherited their wealth. Certainly that's true currently. They've gone out, worked hard and built it, and it's the feeling of tax on tax on tax. So, as I say, I think, yes, we've always seen IHT as a factor, and more people, now that the government have changed the rules, are seeing they have flexibility to do some planning there without having to do some of the things they had before. So it's definitely gone up the ladder, but it's always been a thing that most people, regardless of their political background, have seen as being unfair. Hence why the majority of the countries around the world don't have an inheritance tax. And if you go to countries where they have a wealth tax or something, you'll find it's extremely low, comparatively speaking. I mean, even in America, where billionaires are far more common in the UK, a lot of states, you've got to be worth 10, 20 million and above before inheritance tax kicks in. So, as I say, yeah, the UK quite unusual there in actually having an inheritance tax.
Yeah. Okay, well, as well as freezing the nil rate band, from a personal level, AIM stocks have had the relief cut in half from 40% to 20%. And my private pension that I've nurtured will be subject to inheritance tax now. And therefore, presently, it would be subject to 40% inheritance tax. And my beneficiaries would have to pay their respective rate of tax on any withdrawals, which could potentially erode a further 40% from it doing it nicely. So if I move to another country with a more benevolent income structure and liquidated my pension, what would happen if I returned to the UK in a subsequent tax year?
Well, effectively, you'd be deemed never to have actually left, and HMRC would say, give us all the income tax due on that withdrawal, which, of course, for anyone with a pension fund over 125,000 or so, then that would mean a 45% tax bill on their return. So there are some rules designed to stop people doing that, that require you to be abroad for much longer than a year. And again, just coming back to your question, it's not even just double taxation for quite a large percentage of people. There's triple taxation going on there with the pension rules now. So, you effectively, in some scenarios, can be losing 87% of a pension to the taxman once you take into account all the different ways that you either get taxed or lose allowances.
A mere 87%. Okay. So am I right? Yeah. So am I saying that in order to withdraw from your pension and not being stung for when you may return, that you've got to be outside of the UK for 5 years? Is that right?
Yes, correct. It's called the temporary non-residence rule, and it's 5 years. Yeah. So the answer to the question is yes. It's the last 5 tax years, but that starts from the day you're leaving. So if you happen to take out your pension 4 years, 11 months, and 3 weeks into the time you'd been away, as long as you've been abroad for 5 complete tax years, then the timing of the withdrawal doesn't matter. It's the time you're away.
Right. Okay. But just on this, is there a limit to which you can? I did read something about 100,000. Are you allowed to take 100,000 out before? Because it's about cashing in on the pension, isn't it?
Well, again, this varies from country to country, and what the rules actually say. So, of the countries we offer advice in, you can effectively go abroad and draw it all out and have zero tax on it. That can vary. Even in France, a country that most people would think of as having a sort of bent to it, if you're over state pension age, you can get all of your money out of a pension scheme, a UK pension scheme. This is a SIP or a private pension, not any company pension scheme. You can get it all out with a flat rate of tax at 7.5%. So the amount is immaterial. There's no rule, and it's whatever the rules in the country actually say, and that's driven, by the way, by some of the things that you might have done in the UK. So, for example, if you've taken your 25% tax-free lump sum or whatever the figure you are entitled to out, then that might change the rules. That usually has a knock-on impact on what you can then do once you're abroad. But suffice to say that in all of the countries we operate in, you can pay far lower rates of tax, and I do mean far lower, usually single digits.
Okay. Right. Well, I've gained Mauritius residency, and I'm just using this as an example. It could apply to not a number of other countries, but my understanding is that only monies remitted to Mauritius are subject to income tax. So what would happen if I liquidated my pension, but it retained it in the UK? Would it always be classified as income, irrespective of how long it stayed on deposit in the UK? And separately, what would happen if I never remitted these monies to Mauritius, but subsequently, after say 10 years, returned to the UK?
So, as you know, Mark, we unfortunately don't cover Mauritius. So I can give you a broader answer that generally applies to most countries around the world, which is we will have a double taxation agreement with them that says what happens to taxation of pension income, number one. So that would be the first thing you would look at. The next thing that becomes a complication is what's the definition of a pension, because that varies from country to country. Then you're going to have to consider, am I just moving to, I'm joining their tax regime, coming under anything like a golden visa, which can influence, again, the tax treatment of money that you've got out. But as a general rule of thumb, once you're in another country, their rules will say you will be subject to tax on your worldwide income, regardless of whether you remit it. Because part of the deal of HMRC, for example, allowing money to come out of a pension with no tax deducted is you've registered in another country and they're expecting it to be taxed there, and you are therefore required to disclose it as income, and therefore remittance and receipt are two different things. People take them to mean the same thing, but they're not. So most countries, even if you don't remit, might actually want to tax that income on you. And this comes back to the broader understanding, and this is where we get heavily involved with people. Certain countries will offer favourable tax treatments if you hold the money in investment structure versus. So yeah, the answer can be you can be taxed at the top rates in countries on non-remitted pension income. If you do it the right way, you can usually be taxed at single digit or less.
Okay, so just using Mauritius as an example again, and this is just what my understanding is, but it could get applied to other countries. So, there's no tax on capital, but there is on income. Therefore, it would be advantageous to only remit capital to Mauritius, and therefore, I could leave my income to accrue in the UK and spend it there, or indeed a third country free of income tax. And if you have a UK bank account that's a mix of income and proceeds of capital, how would you differentiate which is which if you remitted monies to Mauritius?
Well, prior to the changes last year, when the UK did used to operate the remittance basis for non-dom individuals, that's exactly this looked at, and you had this phrase clean capital or dirty capital, and it was very, but the UK rules laid out quite clearly how you determined what was what in a sum that you might have sent over to the UK. So using your example, Mark, if it's a bank account that was capital in interest, that will be a combination of two. And if your country does tax remittances and taxes them differently, then I'm going to have to assume that that country will have its own rules for how you determine what proportion is what, and therefore what tax you're going to be. I mean, they would have to by definition. Otherwise, how do you say, it is income or it's capital? So there used to be a huge importance on keeping your pots separately identified for money coming into the UK. That generally now no longer exists except for some older trusts. So, so I can only answer that to the extent that I'm talking what the UK used to do. And most countries, a lot of countries in the world, their taxation and their laws based on what happened in the UK. So I would imagine it would be broadly similar, but I have to caveat that with I don't know. So that would be a great example of if somebody's going to a country and they do tax remittances, then they have to be very clear on how that's been done, because what you might find is if they want you to identify capital gain, income, that by itself, getting an accountant to do that, one of the arguments in the UK used to be if you had to do that, the cost of doing it outweighed the benefit, the tax benefit in doing it.
Okay. So do you think there could be a trend where people live overseas for 10 years plus and then they're trying to guesstimate their life expectancy? They're returning their hope, or not hope, but expectation that they'll not live for another 10 years, and then they won't fall within the UK inheritance tax. And on returning to the UK after 10 years, you'd remain outside in the inheritance tax for that 10 years. If you're fortunate to still be alive and kicking, that you could at some point transfer that money into trust without incurring a 20% penalty.
Well, obviously that remains to be seen in terms of trend, because it's a relatively new rule. But I can definitely tell you that we talk to people about this all the time. And I think, I gave you an example earlier of last year, some people who were going to come back when they were at 9 years and a bit. And we highlighted the 10-year rule to them and why that would be beneficial. So it is related to fantastic set of circumstances for people, even if they've gone abroad with the intention of staying abroad forever, but they decide to come back to the UK for whatever reason. If they've got this, I've been abroad for more than 10 years now, then yes, the next 10 years in the UK, they can be free of inheritance tax. But let me stress, for non-UK situ assets. So if you have a house in the UK and you bring all your money back to the UK, then you're not benefiting from the 10-year rule because it's now UK money. So there is also, by the way, another, for the first 4 years you return to the UK, they have what they call the FIG rules, the foreign income and gain rules, which you can choose to have applied to you. So this Labour government, for all the stuff that they've seen to be doing that's not great, this one change around non-DOMs is actually hugely beneficial for UK people who perhaps weren't overly concerned about inheritance tax, or perhaps older. It's now created this tremendous window of opportunity in the 10 years that they're back. They can do some planning in the first to minimise income and gains. They can then, as the clock ticks on, exactly as you're saying, they might. People often are pessimistic about how long they'll live, and then this clock's ticking down. They now have this opportunity to do things, which includes setting up a trust and avoiding the tax charge, because that 20% tax charge, when you go in, called the entry charge, is an inheritance tax. It's not an income tax. So there's, again, to do things within that 10-year window that people who've remained in the UK to do.
All right. So I think we could just, on that about UK assets, this was something I found interesting, that UK funds, in the UK, funds are considered excluded assets, and they have certain advantages. Can you just elaborate on that for us, Neil?
Yeah, well, the important thing is that the background to that, that used to be this term, excluded property. And again, this was all linked to non-DOMs, and that money that they left outside the UK wouldn't be subject to UK inheritance tax. But even under the old rules, a person who was a non-DOM but eventually become domicile, they would be subject to UK inheritance tax on UK situ assets. So excluded property that specifically linked to funds is the UK government didn't want to put the UK fund and investment management industry at a disadvantage for people coming to the UK. So what they basically said is, if you are an OIC, an open-ended investment company, a unit trust, any of what would be termed collective investments, then they qualified generally under this rule that they were excluded property. And that meant that you could, even though they were physically located in the UK, they were not deemed to be in the UK when it come to doing that assessment about what property is now subject to UK inheritance tax. That rule is still there, but it's shifted quite substantially because of the change now that it's if you leave the UK and you've been UK resident for the previous 10 years, you now have to be outside the UK for more than 10 years. So the first 10 years that you're away, it doesn't matter if you're in a UK fund, it's not excluded property, it's part of your estate for IHT purposes. But once you get to year 10 in one day, a UK fund for a non-long-term resident would still be deemed to be excluded property, meaning when I've stressed this idea of you're subject to UK inheritance tax on UK situ assets, a fund that qualifies as excluded property for a non-long-term resident wouldn't be part of the IHT net.
So just an example, if I've been out of the country for 12 years and say I've got some shares, I'm at death's door, right? Can I just transfer all those shares into funds, keel over, and then they're excluded? Or does there have to be a period of time in which they've been held?
No, it's as long as you hold excluded property and you're non-long-term resident, then it will qualify as being not part of your estate.
Okay. All right, that's interesting. Just moving on to probate. This can be a dragged-out process and it can be costly. Being an expat, does this significantly complicate things?
I would like to say no, and I think that would be the main answer. But again, it depends on how long you've been abroad, because if you go abroad and you buy significant UK assets, then you die within 10 years, then all of those things are part of the probate process. And therefore, it might come down to getting valuations and making sure the assets that you own meet the requirement. So I'll give you an example that most people aren't aware of is individual property. If an asset is worth more than £1,500, then for probate purposes, you're supposed to have an independent valuation on it, unless that asset is something where there's, let's say, a ready market and it's quite easy to value. So a car, for example, you can go online and say, I own an XYZ car this year, this many miles, and you get a valuation. So if you had assets abroad that were worth more than £1,500 and you had to get a valuation, I guess you could argue then, one, finding somebody to do it. Are there language barriers? Do they put it in a format that's acceptable to HMRC? So you could probably make a small argument that it's more complicated, but I don't know if I'd say it's significantly more complicated.
Okay. So just with coming back to inheritance tax, and I know there's lots of countries that don't have an inheritance tax, but, the UK has dictated, what its terms and conditions are, its rules. But is that ever, if another country has inheritance tax rules, is there ever any arguments over who enjoys the spoils?
There can be, but the UK actually, I've mentioned double tax treaties. The UK actually has tax treaties with a small number of countries that only cover inheritance tax. So they try and define this. And the issue usually comes down to where is the asset physically located. That country might take first bite of the cherry normally. But as I say, so many countries don't have inheritance tax, and those who have a tax on death of whatever variance, that might be paid by beneficiaries rather than the estate of the deceased. So it can be problematic there. One of the things that's actually more often a bigger issue for people is not the tax, is that certain countries, France, for example, has what they call forced heirship rules. So in the UK, I can leave my money to anyone I absolutely want. But in France, the rules dictate where, who you can leave it to and who actually has rights on your estate. So that's actually more problematic for most people than where the tax is paid, because as I say, most countries don't have an equivalent of inheritance tax. It's, do the rules basically mean you have to, perhaps a member of the family you don't want to get an inheritance is entitled under the rules of the country where the assets are located. So that's, again, just another example of going way back to earlier in our discussion when we were talking about due diligence and people not knowing what they don't know. When you say to them, okay, this law applies, this rule applies, you can still, the EU, introduce some legislation, and you can choose to where your will is interpreted and things like that. But you obviously can only do that if you're aware of it. So, yes, I don't think there's too many issues around countries fighting over IHT because it's a small number of countries and it's usually fairly clearly defined.
Yeah, we're lucky to be in that very small group, aren't we? I believe running parallel to being out of the country, I would also be running down the 7-year rule. So after 10 years overseas, I understand I could pass on my estate to my children. And it's not subject to the 7-year rule. So if I did return, when would I come back into the 7-year rule again? Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, again, you've got that 10-year window for non-UK situ assets, but any UK situ assets that you give away would be subject to the 7-year rule straight away.
Right, okay. All right, okay.
So this, going back to one of your questions about advising people coming back to the UK, it's often automatic in people's minds to think, right, I will repatriate my money to the UK or do whatever. And there are maybe reasons why that would be beneficial, but from a pure tax perspective, if you've been abroad long enough to get the benefit of the 10-year rule, the non-long-term residents, then generally speaking, you wouldn't want to bring your money back to the UK. And I should stress there that there are plenty of non-UK jurisdictions with investor protection, just as good and in some cases better than what you get in the UK. And you end up owning exactly the same investment. It's just where the structure that's holding them is actually located determines the underlying protection.
Okay. Well, we've covered a number of questions here, and it just shows why Blevins Franks come into play. And there's lots of known unknowns and unknown unknowns. When it comes to the size of estate, what typical range do Blevins Franks cover, and what would you say your sweet spot is?
I mean, as a firm, we're generally looking at people who have assets between 500,000 and 20 million. That's where we see our expertise. And we have clients with less than that, and we have clients with more than that. But I mean, people who have significantly more than that tend to like to use private equity and all sorts of things and can get the inside scoop on certain IPOs and other things like that. So for that reason, whilst we have some, we tend to be people who are under 20 million still don't have access to that type of deal flow. And often, they've made their money by being expert at one thing, but just want to go abroad, have peace of mind, not have to worry about things, are used to paying for services that they value and, want to enjoy their retirement. So that tends to be our marketplace, 500,000 to the 20 million.
Okay. So we're bringing it to a conclusion. I'll just leave you with a tough one. So what do you think, in regards to HMRC, in an ideal world, would they like it that people like Blevins Franks didn't exist, as you're helping people reduce their tax liability, importantly, legally?
I'd almost say it's the complete opposite of that to some extent, because over the last couple of decades, where more rules introduced around what firms like us can do. I mean, we were never into aggressive tax planning, but you might be aware that I'm trying to think, it's more than 10 years ago now, but we had what they call the general anti-avoidance rule introduced, and that says things like, well, if you don't disclose a tax planning scheme, then when your estate comes to try and benefit from it when you're no longer around, it will be looked at that point and might offer none of the benefits that you want. So I think because of regulation and legislation, the taxman likes people like ourselves because, as you say, the advice we're giving is we're not operating in the grey areas of the legislation. We're telling people what black and white rules basically say. And because of that, we have a duty. If we know people are purposely avoiding taxes, then that's, in the regulator's eyes, that's the same as laundering money for, if you're a drug dealer. So we have a requirement to do reporting, and because people will come to us and get advice, that means they're more likely to report and pay taxes that are due, rather than thinking that they can do something and they don't have to report it. I mean, one of the huge things years ago was, I can tell you the number of people I spoke to who lived abroad, and they would say, well, I've lived abroad now. I mean, I'm not subject to inheritance tax. And I would say, well, did you shift your domicile? Did you agree that with HMRC? And they would go, no. And I'd say, well, you're still subject to UK inheritance tax. And, the conversations often went into, well, how are they going to know and what have you? And I mean, that's easy to answer. And with the advent of AI and HMRC System Connect is getting more and more powerful. The entry-exit system that's just effectively came into play a few weeks ago, or should have been in play, where everything's tracked digitally now. So when you're leaving Schengen countries, you should be, all of this is great, and we've got exchange of information between countries. So I think tax regulators like it that people are getting advised, because the advisors are subject to big penalties if they do things as well that are wrong, and therefore, it's less and less nowadays about paying no tax whatsoever. It's more around finding a somewhere that you can live, and that can be in the UK, by the way, as well. I mean, as I say, we've got plenty of clients in the UK where, with the right advice, they can get to a situation where the rate of tax they'll pay is acceptable, and then I'm doing air quotes now, fair to them, because that's the key thing. As I said a while back, most of the people I speak to are very happy paying some taxes. They just get to a point now where they think, you used the phrase broad shoulders, they just don't think it's in their opinion fair. So again, we're there telling people what they can do legally. And, give you one final example, pensions now coming into the IHT next year. So more and more people are saying, I'm remaining in the UK, what can I do with my pensions? And I think you'll find quite a bit of broad advice is draw it out of your pension scheme now to avoid that double or triple taxation potential, and do this with it. And, intuitively, people have already perhaps thought that, but the difference between thinking it and actually going through a proper planning exercise, see the numbers on paper, they tend to come to life, and you can see how you can still be in a far better position in the future by taking good advice, and that advice is sometimes paid tax now. So, I always say, when people say, oh, they're going to change this capital gains tax, it's the classic example. We know from behavioural studies, people just stop selling things. That's no use to the government of the day or HMRC now if they're putting in place tax policies that don't bring in the revenue today. So with people like ourselves, where we're advising people, sometimes that advice is pay this tax now because it's going to be beneficial to your longer term plan. I would suggest they would say that's a good thing.
Okay. So, Neil, all I can say is thanks for your time. I'm certainly wiser, but there's also a lot to think about. Where's the best place for people to reach you?
Well, Mark, I've really enjoyed it, and I really appreciate the invitation to come on board. As I say, I think we've only scratched the surface today, and I know it's gone on for a while already, and I've given some long answers. But if anyone out there listening wants to have a discussion, it's best to email me at my name, Niall Allardice, Neil.Allardice at blevinsfranks.com. And as I say, I'll just go back, NIALL.Allardice, which is ALLARDICE at blevinsfranks.com. And you should find me, even if you search me on the internet as well, and email me, and we can go from there.
Okay, Neil, I think that's a wrap.
That's great. Thanks, Mark.
Well, that's all for this episode. We hope that you enjoyed it. Please remember the content is for information only and it is not financial advice. If you have a question for Mark for our Question in a Bottle podcast, just complete the form on our website, thedesertislandinvestor.co.uk. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.